December 10, 1941, 0830 hours. Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. The air is cold, sharp with the metallic scent of steel and salt from the Sato Inland Sea. Smoke, gray and purposeful, rises from the stacks of the workshops that line the harbor, mingling with the low-hanging winter clouds. Inside the office of a senior naval planner, the mood is one of quiet, supreme confidence. The maps laid out across a vast oak table tell a story of impossible victory. Pearl Harbor is a smoking ruin. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse now rest on the seafloor off Malaya, shattered by naval air power. In less than 72 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy has decapitated 2 enemy fleets and established maritime dominance over the Western Pacific. The planner, a captain in his late 40s, traces a line with his finger from the Philippines down towards the Dutch East Indies. He is not a man given to grand emotion. He is an architect of naval strategy, a student of Mahan and Tsushima. His calculations are precise. He has studied the American industrial base, its peacetime production schedules, its political temperament. He has read their newspapers, analyzed their economic reports. His conclusion, shared by the entire Naval General Staff and the War Cabinet, is simple, and to them, irrefutable. The Americans are a soft people, a nation of merchants obsessed with automobiles and refrigerators, unwilling to make the sacrifices required for total war. Their industry, while large, is sluggish and inefficient, shackled by labor unions and civilian priorities. To retool for war, to build a fleet capable of challenging Japan in her own waters, would take them years, 5, perhaps 6. By then, the war would be over. Japan would be invincible behind its vast island perimeter, and the Americans, weary of the cost, would sue for peace. They calculate the Americans can at best build 3, maybe 4 fleet carriers a year. A formidable number, but one Japan can counter with its own construction and superior naval skill. The war is a calculated risk, but the calculation is sound. In this quiet, smoke-filled room, victory is not a hope. It is a mathematical certainty. He looks out the window towards the colossal shape of the battleship Yamato, resting at her moorings. She is the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power. The largest, most powerful warship ever built, a symbol of technological and spiritual supremacy. She is the final argument in any naval debate. The future, he believes, is secure. He and his comrades have failed to grasp one fundamental truth. They are not at war with the America of the Great Depression. They are at war with the America of the Detroit assembly line. They have awakened a power they cannot comprehend, and in shipyards 10,000 miles away, the steel plates that will form the hulls of their destruction are already being cut. The true calculation has already begun, not in boardrooms, but in the roaring furnaces of Pittsburgh and the sprawling naval yards of Newport News. The number is not 4. It is a figure so vast, so impossible, it would be dismissed as fantasy. The Japanese strategic doctrine that led to the attack on Pearl Harbor was a masterclass in operational brilliance, yet it was built upon a foundation of profound industrial miscalculation. At its heart was the concept of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. This doctrine, born from the stunning victory over the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy (IJN) for nearly 40 years. It presumed a short, violent war in which the numerically superior U.S. Pacific Fleet would be lured across the ocean into a single, cataclysmic engagement. There, the superior training, fighting spirit, the Yamato Damashi, and tactical excellence of the IJN, bolstered by superior torpedo technology and night-fighting capabilities, would annihilate the American fleet. To execute this, Japan had built a magnificent, though limited, naval force. By late 1941, the IJN possessed 10 aircraft carriers, including the formidable fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. This was the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force on the planet. Its pilots were the best in the world, hardened by years of combat in China, with an average of over 800 flying hours each. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M fighter, were world beaters, outclassing anything the Allies could immediately field. The plan was simple. The Pearl Harbor attack would cripple the American battleship line, buying Japan 6 months to a year to conquer Southeast Asia and the Pacific, securing the vital resources: oil, rubber, tin, needed to sustain a long war. Once this defensive perimeter was established, they would wait for the inevitable American counterattack and destroy it in the Kantai Kessen. The fatal flaw in this logic was the assumption that Japan could control the timeline. They viewed American industrial power through the lens of their own. Japanese naval construction was a meticulous, almost artisanal process. The magnificent Shokaku-class carriers, for example, took nearly 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Their industrial base was narrow, heavily reliant on imported machine tools and raw materials, and incapable of the kind of explosive expansion required for a protracted global conflict. They projected their own limitations onto their enemy. On the other side of the Pacific, the strategic landscape was entirely different. While the United States was militarily unprepared for war in December 1941, it was an industrial superpower without equal. The groundwork for a naval arms race had already been laid. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of July 1940, passed over a year before Pearl Harbor, was the largest naval procurement bill in American history. It authorized a staggering 70% increase in fleet strength, including 18 new aircraft carriers. The plans were drawn, the funding allocated. The industrial engine was not sleeping. It was idling, waiting for the signal to engage. The heart of this new naval air armada was the Essex-class aircraft carrier, displacing 27,100 tons. These ships were a quantum leap over their pre-war predecessors like the Yorktown and Enterprise. They were designed for mass production, with simplified layouts and standardized components. They could carry over 90 aircraft, a 30% increase in capacity, and were equipped with advanced radar, powerful anti-aircraft batteries of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons, and superior damage control systems. While the IJN focused on creating the perfect weapon for a single decisive battle, the U.S. Navy and American industry were preparing to win a war of attrition. They weren't just building a fleet. They were building a factory that produced fleets. The Japanese calculation allowed for an American response. It did not allow for an avalanche. For 22-year-old welder Frank Morrison, the war began not with the sound of explosions, but with the shriek of a factory whistle on a frigid Virginia morning. Before Pearl Harbor, the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company was a busy place. Now it was a city within a city, electrified by a singular, furious purpose. The sprawling yard, covering hundreds of acres along the James River, had become a cauldron of creation, a landscape of raw, industrial might. Frank's world was a symphony of overwhelming noise and focused effort. The percussive thump-thump-thump of 10-ton drop hammers forging steel, the deafening roar of pneumatic rivet guns stitching hull plates together, the hiss and brilliant white-blue flash of his own welding torch laying a bead of molten steel. He worked 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, his body aching and his eyes burning from the constant glare. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and coal smoke from the yard's power plant. At night, he would fall into his bunk in a crowded boarding house, the phantom flashes of the arc welder still dancing behind his eyelids. His younger brother, Jimmy, was a sailor, a radio man aboard the cruiser USS Astoria. Jimmy's last letter, written from Honolulu in late November, spoke of warm weather and the easy life of a peacetime Navy. Frank hadn't heard from him since the attack. Every steel plate he welded, every seam he fused felt like a personal act of vengeance and protection. He wasn't just building a ship. He was building a fortress for boys like Jimmy. Frank was working on Ship Hull 393. To the planners in Washington, it was CV-9. To the thousands of men and women swarming over its skeleton, it was just the new carrier. It would eventually be christened USS Essex. From his vantage point on the scaffolding, Frank could see the sheer scale of the undertaking. The keel, a massive steel spine, had been laid in April 1941. Now a skeletal city of ribs and bulkheads rose from it, a steel cathedral taking shape. Cranes like giant mechanical birds swung prefabricated sections weighing over 50 tons into place. Down in the engine rooms, machinists were installing the massive turbines and boilers that would give the ship its 150,000 horsepower heart. This scene was being replicated at shipyards across the country, at Fore River in Quincy, Massachusetts, at the New York Naval Shipyard, at Camden, New Jersey. An entire ecosystem of industry fed these yards. Steel from Pennsylvania, wiring from Ohio, turbines from General Electric in New York, armor plate from West Virginia. The genius of the American system was not just its scale, but its coordination. Henry J. Kaiser, the industrialist who perfected mass production of Liberty ships, brought his methods to carrier construction. Prefabrication was key. Huge sections of the ship were built on the ground and then lifted into place, dramatically cutting down construction time. What was once a bespoke craft became an assembly line. While one carrier was being fitted out in the water, the keel of the next was being laid in the same slip. There was no pause, no hesitation. The rhythm of the yard was relentless. For Frank Morrison and millions like him, the abstract concept of war had become tangible, measured in tons of steel and feet of weld. They did not know the grand strategy, but they understood their part in it. They were building a tsunami plate by plate. The Japanese leadership's failure to comprehend American industrial potential was not born of ignorance, but of a deeply ingrained cultural and strategic arrogance. Their analysis was meticulous but flawed, filtered through a prism of their own national experience. They saw the United States as a nation of individuals, while they were a nation of subjects, bound by a sacred duty to the emperor. This belief in the superiority of the Japanese spirit, Yamato Damashi, was a tangible factor in their strategic planning. They believed their pilots, sailors, and soldiers imbued with this spirit could consistently outperform their American counterparts on a 3-to-1 basis. A material deficit, therefore, was not a fatal weakness. Their economic intelligence was similarly skewed. Japanese analysts looked at pre-war American production figures, the number of ships built in 1938, the time it took to construct a Yorktown-class carrier, and extrapolated those figures forward. They failed to understand the concept of slack capacity. The American economy was not operating at 100% before the war. It was still shaking off the Great Depression. Its true potential was dormant. The Japanese, whose own industry was perpetually straining at its limits, could not conceive of an economy with such vast, untapped power. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was one of the few who had spent significant time in America and had an inkling of its true strength. His famous, possibly apocryphal warning about awakening a sleeping giant spoke to this fear. Yet even he was bound by the prevailing doctrine and the political reality that war was inevitable. The Japanese intelligence services also fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American manufacturing. They saw it as a system geared for consumer goods. They couldn't grasp how quickly the Ford Motor Company could pivot from producing sedans to B-24 Liberator bombers, one every 63 minutes at its peak. They couldn't imagine how a company that made tractors could start churning out M4 Sherman tanks. This adaptability, this fluidity of capital and labor, was a foreign concept. In a 1942 report to the Naval General Staff, one analyst confidently stated that U.S. carrier production would be severely hampered by shortages of high-tensile steel, skilled labor, and complex gearing mechanisms for the turbines. They predicted that the U.S. could lay down perhaps 4 or 5 Essex-class carriers in the first year of the war, but that completion would take 36 to 48 months for each. This meant the new wave of American carriers would not begin to reach the Pacific in significant numbers until late 1944 or even 1945. By then, the Kontai-Kessen would have been fought and won. This conviction permeated the IJN. After the stunning victory at Pearl Harbor and the sinking of the Prince of Wales, a sense of invincibility took hold. Even after the shocking loss of 4 fleet carriers at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the belief in their qualitative superiority remained. Midway was seen as a tactical blunder, a fluke, not a symptom of a deeper strategic rot. They set about replacing their losses, laying down the new Unryu-class carriers, simplified versions of the pre-war Hiryu design. They were good ships, but Japan could only manage to build 3 of them before the war ended. They were trying to replenish a well, while the Americans were turning on a fire hose. The Japanese expected a naval duel. They were about to face an industrial deluge. The year is 1943. While the brutal ground campaigns grind on in Guadalcanal and New Guinea, a different kind of battle is being decisively won in the shipyards of the United States. The theory of American industrial might is becoming a terrifying reality. The numbers are staggering, defying all pre-war predictions, especially those made in Tokyo. In April 1941, the keel of USS Essex, CV-9, was laid. She was launched in July 1942 and commissioned on the last day of the year. A construction time of just over 20 months, already faster than the Japanese anticipated. But this was just the beginning. The machine was learning, accelerating. Her sister ship, the new USS Yorktown, CV-10, named for the carrier lost at Midway, had her keel laid in December 1941, just after Pearl Harbor. She was launched in January 1943 and commissioned in April. Construction time, 16 months. Then came the flood. USS Intrepid, CV-11, 16 months. USS Hornet, CV-12, named for the other carrier lost at Midway, 16 months. USS Franklin, CV-13, 14 months. USS Ticonderoga, CV-14, 15 months. USS Randolph, CV-15, 16 months. USS Lexington, CV-16, 17 months. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, 16 months. USS Wasp, CV-18, 16 months. By the end of 1943, the U.S. Navy had commissioned 8 new Essex-class fleet carriers, with more hitting the water every few weeks. This was on top of the 9 Independence-class light carriers, built on converted cruiser hulls, that were also joining the fleet. In a single year, the United States had produced more carrier deck space than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at the start of the war. The contrast with Japan was stark. The IJN had lost 4 of its best carriers at Midway. The carrier Taiho, their most advanced design, was laid down in July 1941 and would not be commissioned until March 1944, a construction time of 32 months. Their Unryu-class program, intended to replace the Midway losses, produced its first ship in August 1944. They were fighting a war of replacement, while the U.S. was fighting a war of exponential growth. The human and material logistics behind the American achievement were monumental. At its peak, the American shipbuilding industry employed over 1.7 million people. New techniques were constantly being developed. Hulls were welded instead of riveted, which was faster and resulted in a lighter, stronger ship. Entire sections, complete with wiring and plumbing, were built in workshops and then lowered into place. The process was a relentless 24/7 operation. As these new carriers joined the fleet, they formed the core of a revolutionary new naval concept, the Fast Carrier Task Force. No longer were carriers mere escorts for battleships. They were now the centerpiece of naval power, a mobile sovereign territory that could project overwhelming air power anywhere in the world. Task Force 58, as it would become known, was a naval force of unimaginable strength. In early 1944, it could put over 900 aircraft into the air at once. It was a self-contained ecosystem of destruction, complete with its own screen of new battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and a massive logistics train of oilers and supply ships that allowed it to operate at sea for months on end. The Japanese doctrine of Kantai Kessen was designed to fight a fleet. Task Force 58 was not a fleet. It was a mobile nation-state, forged of steel and fire, and it was sailing west, June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the armored carrier Taiho. He commanded the IJN's first mobile fleet, the last best hope of the Japanese Empire. It was a powerful force, built around 9 aircraft carriers including the veteran fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, and carrying 473 aircraft. His mission was to execute Operation Eigo, a decisive stroke to shatter the American fleet supporting the invasion of Saipan. This would be the Kantai Kessen the Navy had dreamed of for decades. Ozawa had advantages. His aircraft had a greater range than their American counterparts, and the prevailing winds would allow him to launch his strikes from outside the effective range of the U.S. fleet, a tactic known as shuttling. Facing him was Admiral Raymond Spruance's U.S. Fifth Fleet, specifically Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. The numbers were crushing. Mitcher commanded 15 carriers, 7 heavy Essex-class and 8 light Independence-class. On their deck sat 956 aircraft. The sky over Task Force 58 was protected by a new generation of American naval fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. It was fast, rugged, heavily armed with 650 caliber machine guns and easy to fly. It was designed for one purpose: to kill Zeros. The Japanese pilots, once the undisputed masters of the sky, were no longer the elite veterans of 1941. The best had been lost over the Coral Sea, at Midway, and in the brutal aerial attrition over the Solomon Islands. The new pilots were brave and determined, but they were hastily trained. With a fraction of the flight hours of their predecessors, they were flying aircraft that had been only incrementally improved, while the Americans were now equipped with planes that were a full generation ahead. The battle began just after 10 a.m. Ozawa launched his first wave of 69 aircraft. They never stood a chance. Detected more than 150 miles out by the superior American radar, they were met by a wall of Hellcats. The radio net of Task Force 58 came alive with the now legendary transmission from a gleeful American pilot. "Hey, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." It was a massacre. The Japanese formations, lacking the skill to maintain discipline under pressure, were torn apart. Hellcats dove from above, their 6 machine guns shredding the fragile Zeros and Judy dive bombers. Of the 69 aircraft in the first wave, 42 were shot down before they ever saw an American ship. The few that broke through were savaged by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire, a dense curtain of steel thrown up by thousands of computer-guided Bofors and Oerlikon guns. The second Japanese wave of 128 aircraft met an even worse fate. 97 were shot down. A third and fourth wave were launched, and they too were slaughtered. By the end of the day, the IJN had lost over 350 aircraft and 2 of its carriers, including Ozawa's flagship Taiho and the veteran Shokaku, to American submarine attacks. The American losses were around 30 aircraft. The unexpected outcome for the Japanese was not merely defeat. It was annihilation on a scale that beggared belief. Their doctrine, their technology, their pilot training system, all of it had failed in a single catastrophic afternoon. The battle wasn't a contest of skill against skill. It was a contest of a modern, integrated, technologically superior military system against one that had been rendered obsolete. The industrial might of the United States, forged in the shipyards of Newport News and the factories of Long Island, had been translated into a decisive and brutal combat victory. The Kantai Kessen had arrived, and it was a slaughter. The reports that filtered back to Admiral Ozawa, and eventually to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, were so lopsided they seemed to be fabrications. The loss of hundreds of aircraft and their irreplaceable crews, for a return of virtually zero damage to the American fleet, was incomprehensible. It defied the logic of naval warfare as they understood it. For decades, the IJN had been nurtured on the myth of its own spiritual and tactical superiority. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not just challenge this myth, it utterly destroyed it. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the experience was profoundly traumatic. They had flown into a buzzsaw. They saw entire squadrons evaporate in minutes. They were hounded by Hellcats that could outclimb, outdive, and outgun their Zeros, and whose pilots seemed to be everywhere at once. One surviving Japanese aviator described it as a sky full of enemy bees. The confidence that had carried them through the early years of the war was shattered, replaced by a grim understanding of their own technological and numerical inferiority. The will to fight remained, but the belief in victory was extinguished. This psychological blow was, in many ways, more devastating than the loss of the carriers themselves. It marked the birth of desperation, the point where the rationale for the kamikaze attacks began to take root. If they could not win conventionally, they would win through sacrifice. For the Americans, the Great Marianas turkey shoot was a moment of supreme, terrifying validation. The pilots of the F-6F Hellcat became legends, aces in a day. The system, the radar operators who gave them early warning, the flight deck crews who launched and recovered them with breathtaking efficiency, the anti-aircraft gunners who formed the final shield, had worked to perfection. There was an overwhelming sense of industrial and military dominance. They had faced the best the Japanese Navy could field, and had swatted it aside with almost casual ease. This victory engendered a powerful, perhaps even dangerous sense of invincibility within the U.S. Navy. They had created a weapon, the fast carrier task force that seemed unstoppable. It confirmed that the long, arduous work on the home front was paying off in the most dramatic way possible. The letters home from sailors and pilots were no longer filled with the grim uncertainty of 1942, but with a swaggering confidence. They knew with a certainty that could only be born in the crucible of such a one-sided battle that they were going to win the war. The question was no longer if, but when. The psychological tide of the Pacific War had turned irrevocably. One side now fought with the cold fury of an industrial giant, while the other was left with little more than the courage of the doomed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the death knell of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm. It ceased to exist as an effective offensive force. The carriers that survived, like the Zuikaku, would serve as little more than decoys in the upcoming Battle of Leyte Gulf, their flight decks empty of trained pilots and modern aircraft. The strategic initiative in the Pacific now belonged entirely to the United States. The capture of the Mariana Islands, secured by the victory at sea, provided the basis from which B-29 superfortresses could begin the final, devastating air campaign against the Japanese home islands. The broader impact was a stark lesson in the nature of modern warfare. The Second World War was not ultimately decided by tactical brilliance or the fighting spirit of individual soldiers, though those were important. It was decided by logistics, production, and the ability to mobilize an entire national economy for a single purpose. Japan's leaders had wagered that their initial victories could win them the war before America's industrial power could be brought to bear. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. They had started a timer, believing they had years, when in reality they only had months. The statistics tell the final story. Over the course of the war, the United States commissioned 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and a staggering 122 escort carriers. Japan, in the same period, managed to build only 4 new fleet carriers and 6 light carriers to supplement its pre-war force. The American industrial engine had not just replaced its losses, it had created a force so large that no combination of enemy powers could hope to challenge it. Each of those hulls represented a colossal national effort, a convergence of resources, manpower, and ingenuity. In the shipyards of Newport News, welders like Frank Morrison heard the news of the victory on the radio. They saw the names of the ships they had built, Essex, Lexington, Bunker Hill, in the newspaper reports. The connection was direct and powerful. The long hours, the sweat, the burning eyes, it had all been for this. Their labor had been forged into a weapon that had saved the lives of countless American soldiers and sailors, perhaps even his brother Jimmy, whose cruiser had been sunk at the Battle of Savo Island, but who had survived and was now serving on a new destroyer. The Japanese belief that America could not build 10 carriers a year was more than a simple intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine a system like the one they had attacked, a system that could absorb a devastating blow, grieve its losses, and then unleash a productive fury that would ultimately grind their empire into dust. The war in the Pacific was a clash of cultures and strategies, but at its core, it was an unanswerable mathematical equation. And the final brutal answer was launched, hull by gleaming hull, from the slipways of America.